Hi, it's Louisa Dahl. And welcome to the Interactive Minds podcast, where I talk with passionate marketers, innovators, and digital leaders about their specific recipes for success. In today's show, I interview Nick McIntosh, talking about the process he went through in finding his next senior role. Here's 4 things you're going to learn. 1, the right balance in setting your criteria for your next role. 2, a structured job search process you can follow with 5 channels to cover off. 3, why you need to refine your story around solving problems. And 4, how to use LinkedIn to get connected with meaningful contacts. Let's get into it. Today I'm here with Nick McIntosh, who is the Senior Director of Product Management at Zendrive. About a decade ago, Nick was working with us at Interactive Minds, helping us to run events for marketers. I'm super excited to have you on the show, Nick, and to catch up. Welcome.
Thanks, Louisa. It's really nice to be here. It's been quite a while.
It has. It's been a long time. We've stayed in touch, but this is probably our first chat in a number of years. And you've been doing some really interesting things. So you obviously used to be here in Brisbane in Australia with us, but you're currently living in San Francisco and prior to that lived for several years in Beijing. Can you tell us what you've been up to over the last decade since you left Australia?
Sure, I can do my best. So let me see. Last time we were working together on Interactive Minds, I think was 2011.
Yeah, that's right.
And at the time, I was really sort of running my own business in Australia, a company called Digital Done Different, and I've been doing that for a number of years, working with sort of business owners, sort of like Interactive Minds and other companies, trying to help them scale their digital marketing, their online e-commerce presence, those kind of activities. And then, to be honest, I felt like I was probably struggling to differentiate myself a little bit in that industry in Australia at the time, and not really finding a lot of career models or business models that I felt I wanted to emulate. And sort of after a few years, felt like I was like, all right, I'm grinding this out here. And I can see how there's a path to continue and grow this business and sort of turn it into probably an agency model. But maybe there's other things. And about the time I was reading a lot of books on sort of taking a business on the road. At the time, Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Workweek was very popular. And I remember reading that and thinking, okay, maybe I can look at this from a different perspective. And decided on almost a whim, really, to go and pack up and go to China for what originally was going to be 6 months, with the idea that I will go and learn a different culture, try and learn some of the language, and get myself in the middle of something between China and Australia, with sort of the backup plan that, hey, I can always come back to this business and sort of it will always be here if as a fallback. If for whatever reason this path doesn't bring anything that's interesting.
Yeah, and you were learning Chinese at that time, I remember as well, when you were helping us. So you went to China, and then what happened?
So yeah, I spent 6 months banging my head against textbooks, trying to wrap my head around Chinese. And sort of after 6 months, got decent at Chinese. I could do sort of 10, 15 minutes of small talk pretty comfortably.
Yep.
But it was clear to me like spending all my time on language learning really wasn't bringing me happiness and joy on a day-to-day basis. I would go to class, I would sit in class, I'd get drilled on some aspect of vocabulary, and then like, all right, well, what do I do the rest of my day? Well, I've been assigned all this homework. It feels like I'm back in school. This isn't fun. So I started to go to some sort of networking events on evenings and weekends, and found the startup scene in Beijing, and bumped into this startup company at the time called App Annie, which was sort of a Series A startup, 20 people doing some interesting things with mobile apps and mobile app data that I had some experience around from some previous projects. And they were doing a product launch at the time. And they were really stretched for sort of people to help them with this. And I went in and I had a meeting with the head of marketing and sort of talked about some of the things that I'd worked on and that we'd worked on Interactive Minds, for example.
Yep.
And he said, hey, well, maybe it'd be great actually if you can come in and help us with this product launch. We need sort of the classic digital marketing skill set to sort of get us over the line here. It's the mix of, well, we need to do some copywriting. We need to get some email templates out the door. We need to get a landing page. We need to make sure that we have customer service scripts set up for when people start asking about this. And we need some help to produce some things like infographics. So that was really where it started. And I thought I was going to work with this company for maybe 3 months as like a short-term project while I fill my time with looking for what else might keep me engaged.
Yep.
And that 3 months turned into 7 years and 2 continents.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. And how did you transition that from that initial piece of work into your role, what ended up being in product?
So I think one of the things that I got very lucky with, and also perhaps is a little bit different from the way that I sort of in retrospect feel many people approach their work, is that within a couple of months of working with the team at App Annie, we had a bit of a crisis internally. Something went wrong with one of the products, and a lot of our users and customers were no longer able to access the product overnight, and we had no idea what was wrong. And this occurred on like a Friday late afternoon when everyone was walking out the door. And I remember sort of being aware that some of the engineering team was looking a bit stressed, but I didn't really have much context for what was happening. So I packed up and went home for the evening and sort of kept an eye on emails. And then I was sort of watching more and more emails come in and like, these guys have got a problem.
Yeah.
And I feel like at that point I could have very easily taken the path of, well, I'm the new marketing guy. I'm here for a project. I'll check in on Monday and see how they handled it.
Yep.
Or I sent a text message actually to my boss, the head of marketing, saying, hey, I'm seeing all this. Do you need some help? Do you want me to come in tomorrow morning on a Saturday and sort of see if I can help you work through this? And he ummed and ahed for a little while and actually said, yeah, actually, that's probably not a bad idea. Come in as early as you can. And that really, I think, set the tone for my approach to working in my role and working with this company over the next 7 years. It's like, there's something happening here. Let's do what's necessary. And that initial sort of crisis, and I think really wanting to dive in and get my hands dirty with that team when, frankly, I really didn't have to. I think that stood out to the executive team at the time. And that suddenly went from, okay, well, you're working on marketing to now we need you to run these products for us, please. And that sort of responsibility snowballed over the subsequent years as the company grew and had some success with different things and customers signed on. And I mean, by the time I left in early 2019, it had gone from $1 million in revenue to $100 million in revenue, and 20 people in a one-room, pretty basic office in an uncool part of Beijing to 500 people across, I think, 15 or 16 different offices around the world.
Yeah, wow. That must have been an amazing journey to be part of that growth.
Yeah, I feel very lucky to have had that experience, really.
Yeah, fantastic. And now you're in San Francisco and working for Zendrive. Can you tell us, first of all, for those who don't know, what's Zendrive and what does your current role involve?
Sure. So my current role is Senior Director of Product Management, and Zendrive is a company that provides software-based vehicle telematics. So what that means is that using the sensors in your mobile phone, when that mobile phone is riding along in a vehicle, whether it's like in your cup holder or in the cradle on your dashboard with maps on it, that mobile phone can understand how that vehicle is actually being driven if Zendrive software is running on that phone. So there's a lot of interesting applications there for insurance companies, for auto OEMs, and really for anyone who's interested to understand, you know what, this is a good driver, this is a bad driver, this driver gets on the accelerator and then slams on the brake every intersection, or this one's sort of gliding along smoothly. There's lots of good applications for that data.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And so what does your role involve as Director of Product Management?
A lot of what my role involves, and I joined the company now a couple of months ago, so a lot of my time has been spent on sort of understanding a new environment and a new set of colleagues and a new industry. Most of my focus at the moment is on what I would say is the go-to-market end of product management, really looking at how we can take our technology and apply it into different market segments and what are the value propositions that different market segments are looking to solve and how that technology might fit against that, and also the different business models that we might need to come up with as to reflect like the needs of those different segments. So it's sort of perhaps that classic challenge around product management where you've got some fantastic technical capabilities and now you've got to marry it with a strong market need.
Sounds like a fun role.
It's fun. It's product management. I think it's just like a fantastic function. It's complicated. You have imperfect information at every time, and you have to put together the best case you can for where to go, what to do next. And all that comes within the backdrop of a typically VC-backed company. So there is the expectation that you need to do something and do it really quickly so that you're able to capture market share before someone else does.
Yeah, definitely. Now, we are going to talk today about some of your process in getting your most recent job. And I know you took a really deliberate role to how you approached your job search, and that you have also been really generous in sharing some of those learnings with your friends and peers perhaps. So I'm keen to get into understanding, I suppose, what that job search looked like for you, what the process was like, and getting some learnings from you along the way. So you moved from China to the US with your previous employer, and then you left that business and you were looking for a new role. At that point, what were your initial expectations when you started job hunting? How long did you think it was going to take, and what process did you expect to go through?
My initial expectations were that given the time that I had spent with my previous company, I was there for 7 years, which in the Bay Area is very rare. And given the success that sort of that company had and the rate of growth and the outcomes that we'd achieved there, and also sort of given my seniority as a vice president of product, I thought, all right, well, I'm going to enjoy a couple of months off. I did sort of the atypical thing of actually finishing up my role without the next thing lined up.
Yep.
And thought, well, I'll chill out. It's been a good sort of hard slog for 7 years, and I'm going to enjoy some downtime. And then I'm going to open up my LinkedIn inbox and I'm going to see who wants to hire me, basically.
Sounds very idealistic, Nick.
And funnily enough, it didn't play out like that. And I mean, I thought sort of, sure, there'll be a little bit of work here. I will want to go and connect with some of the talent teams that exist here in the Bay Area, particularly from the venture capital funds who keep track of where people are and what openings exist. And I'll go and do a coffee meeting here and there. And, I'll have a couple of offers within 2 or 3 months, and then I'll pick the one that looks sort of most appealing to me.
Yep. Okay. So I'm keen to hear, the end of this story as well, of course, but let's go through this a little bit. So when you kind of realized that, maybe it wasn't going to be quite that easy at the end of the break and open your inbox to see what was there, what did you do? Like, how did you start looking?
Sure. So, I had some pretty specific ideas in mind of what I wanted to do next. I was really very focused on moving into this mobility and transportation industry and looking for businesses within that, and also wanting to combine some of the things that I've been doing in the past around mobile data, the mobile ecosystem, and of course, sort of keeping within really my function of product management leadership. So I was trying to tick 3 or 4 boxes, depending on how you want to count it, all at the same time. And that certainly sort of made it a bit challenging because I would look at an opportunity and say, hey, that looks like a really good opportunity, but you know what? It's only 2.5 out of 3. So
yeah.
I'll just put that aside for a moment. And then another one would come along and say, oh, it looks like a great company. Wow. I know that founder. That founder is like someone who gets a lot of press on TechCrunch and they're doing some really cool things, but it's not in the right vertical. So, all right, well, I'll put that aside.
Do you think in hindsight that was a good thing being so specific or not a good thing? Because I think sometimes when people do start looking for their next role, they're kind of open to anything and they don't really have that, I don't know, that approach of knowing exactly what they want. So did that work in your favor ultimately, or did you find that maybe it kept you back a little bit?
I think it definitely, it definitely slowed things down. And it definitely, after a while, when I didn't see a string of opportunities that ticked every box, made me then it forced me to prioritize, obviously, which is, funnily enough, a classic product management skill. So it's something that I should have expected and sort of been prepared for. I really took the long view in this, in that I was looking for opportunities that I felt were not just going to be like a good paycheck or sort of a good title or a good brand, but really opportunities that I felt were going to bring me sort of long-term satisfaction, and had businesses and business models that I felt were frankly valuable to the world. And there were a lot of opportunities that were presented to me where the salary was fantastic, the role was and the title was fantastic, the company was well funded, but it was a problem area that I just had no interest in thinking about for more than about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And sort of, I made a joke at the time that I think towards the middle of last year, I was tripping over opportunities with crypto platforms. It seems like everyone wanted to hire product leadership for their latest blockchain enterprise. And that's fantastic if you're into blockchain. But for me personally, I'm not that excited about blockchain. And I didn't believe that I could spend more than probably a couple of weeks really diving deep on that before getting bored, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's really important to identify. And I think, from that perspective and knowing where you ended up, you obviously managed to find the job that you were looking for. So let's talk then about, so when you wanted to get started, you mentioned LinkedIn as a tool that you were looking to use. What else did you do to, actively start looking for a role?
Sure. So I tend to get pretty structured about these things. Funnily enough, I'm pretty type A. I like making lists. Putting check boxes on stuff is just, it's like crap to me.
That's why we work so well together.
I kind of broke this into, I think, 5 different channels, and really structured it almost like an exercise in CRM. So I had LinkedIn inbound, which is obviously the stuff that's people are pinging about. LinkedIn outbound, which was me making a really big list of all the companies that I thought were interesting and relevant to the kinds of problems that I was interested to solve. And then I would just find people on LinkedIn that worked at those companies and reached out to them and tried to start a conversation. I think the third one was LinkedIn jobs. So all the traditional job postings you see. And then the fourth one would be recruiters and VC and sort of headhunters. And then the fifth one is really sort of the informal network that I have of my friends and contacts that I've met.
Yeah, that's a very structured approach. I mean, it's great to have them mapped out. So thank you for sharing those. What was it like then when you reached out to people? How many meetings, coffees did you start to have off the back of that? And did that happen fairly quickly, or what kind of time frame, did things start moving?
So I think I did all up something in the order of about 150 intro calls and coffee meetings, which sounds like a lot.
It does. It is a lot.
If someone's looking at this going, wow, I've got to do 150 coffee meetings before I find my next job, it's like, no, I don't believe that. And I think this comes down to how picky and precise I was trying to be.
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of that I think was very well spent in terms of time, because it helped me to dial in where there was a good overlap between the kind of things that I've been working on and the opportunities that were out there, and where my experience was going to be relevant and a good fit, and also where there'd be less traction. And that was also, I think, really valuable because it gave me the opportunity to meet people, practice my story, which is something that I definitely needed time to tune. And I thought there was going to be some pieces of my experience, particularly managing teams between the US and China and Europe, that I thought was, for me, really interesting and something I love to talk about.
Yep.
But very quickly got feedback, no one cares. So
Right.
I was like, oh, all right, well, let me put that story aside and let me tell you about this great product that I built and all the revenue that came from that. And that was much more something that resonated.
Okay, great. So getting that feedback along the way was definitely helpful for you. And no doubt the contacts that you made throughout those coffees and catch-ups was valuable kind of long-term for you as well.
I sure hope so. And that's something that I think once you've done that work, I've now got to stay diligent and make sure that those contacts and those conversations that I had don't die in the vine, and they're there and maintained over years to come.
Yeah, definitely. Now, for those people who might say, yeah, well, that's great that you can find people on LinkedIn, but how do you go from finding someone at a company that you might be interested in to actually getting a coffee with them? What was your approach? How did you frame that catch up?
Oh, so I have a secret weapon, and my secret weapon is my wife. And my wife works in sales, and she spends all day, every day on LinkedIn, and is kind of a pro in getting people to answer, and never takes no for an answer. And that's frankly something that I had to learn. And I pretty early on sort of would spend maybe an hour and a half on LinkedIn identifying people, then crafting the perfect message, and then debating, well, should I send a connection request first, or should I send an email? And at the end of that hour and a half, my net result was I had reached out to 2 people. But I reached out to 2 people in what I thought was the perfect way.
Yes.
And she quickly turned around and said, hey, you're kind of doing this wrong. It's going to take you the rest of the year to work through your list here of 300 companies that you've identified. You need to really just ramp this up. And I mean, sort of at the end of the day, the way I did it was to focus less on sending emails and send more just connection requests with a message attached. Because certainly sort of what I found is when I personally get an email, it's like, someone spent money to get in front of me. It's probably someone who is trying to sell me something. It's probably not a high quality message, so I'm not sure how much attention I'm going to give that. Whereas if someone reaches out with a connection request and the message is relevant to me, it's like, yeah, sure. Okay, I'll read this, I'll connect, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah. So you connect with them in that way. And then how did you, I imagine then you had to have some messages with them to get them to catch up with you. What was the next step in that?
I reached out and just simply said, hey, I'm most of the time really just interested in learning about your business. Do you have 10 minutes for a quick call? And I think one of the advantages I had then was very much the title that I had from my previous company. I think vice president of product carries some weight, and also that brand of App Annie is quite well known here in the Bay Area.
Yep.
So that I think is a sort of a helpful advantage to have, but I don't feel like that was the be all and end all. I think one thing I really tried to focus on was make it easy for the other person to say yes. I think a 10-minute quick chat on the phone is something that most people, if they see that the other person on the end of the communication is genuine, it's a really easy thing to say yes to. Yeah. And then as quickly as I possibly could, I'd get them off LinkedIn into an email and set up a calendar, and I would get a phone number and I would call their phone at the time we agreed and have a 10-minute chat on the dot, if that was what we agreed to, unless they sort of had time to extend the conversation further.
Yeah. And when you spoke to them, what did that call look like?
It was quite a simple structure of let me introduce myself, let me explain why I'm interested in your company and the kinds of opportunities that I'm looking for. And let's see if there is a reason here to take the conversation further. And really what I was looking for is I was looking for those opportunities that don't exist yet on LinkedIn, those opportunities for sort of that an organization is thinking about opening but hasn't yet opened. And I was trying to get ahead of that and find the golden nuggets opportunities that often get fed through headhunters, that get fed through sort of more private channels before they eventually sort of wind up in the public forum.
And did you find some of those through this type of approach?
Yeah, I think very much sort of at a certain level of seniority, that's very much how it works in the Bay Area, is that sort of more senior roles tend to get filtered through sort of private networks first to see what kind of candidates are out there before really becoming sort of publicly visible on things like job boards.
So once you started this process and had catch-ups, applied for jobs, etc., what was the next step? So how many interviews did you have and what format was the next interaction?
I think at the end of the day, there was something like 50 odd opportunities that I sort of more formally like applied for and sort of submitted the resume and had sort of that more structured conversation with a recruiter and then sort of the subsequent hiring manager. Very much it can be sort of a pretty drawn out process. It can be going from sort of that initial sort of phone screen, potentially a sort of a couple of phone calls to sort of an on-site, several on-sites, very often. In fact, I think pretty much at every conversation, once it reaches a certain point, there's some sort of presentation or some sort of homework piece. I found that for the offers that I did receive, it was a 2-month process minimum to go from that first touch to when a verbal offer was extended. And there was a few that I ultimately decided to walk away from. And at the extreme end of things, I had one opportunity that I pursued where I did 9 rounds of interviews over 4 months and sort of spoke with the CEO, I think 4 or 5 times during that. And that was, I think, really challenging to me because when I've been a hiring manager in the past, I felt a great deal of urgency to when I've found a candidate or when I have an opening, get that opening filled so that I can then hit my deliverables. So definitely having that lack of urgency there was something that took me a little while to get comfortable with.
Why do you think that was? What was holding them back from making a hiring decision sooner than 4 months or 5 months?
I don't know, maybe I wasn't a good candidate. Maybe they met me and they're like holding out for someone better. I'm not sure.
So you don't think it was more of a timing factor within the business or a budgetary factor? You think they were just taking their time and getting to know potential candidates?
I think it could be any one of those. I think it's sometimes your timing matters. And if you show up when they've just opened the rec and you're the first candidate they speak with, then inevitably you're going to sort of probably be sitting there for a while as they sort of look at other candidates and then really try and make sure that they're making the best decision for the business. I think at other points, priorities can change. And I've certainly experienced this in the past when I've been hiring, is that startups are often highly volatile places and their needs can shift week to week. So a role that was there and was top priority on week 1, now 2 weeks later, looks like it's actually maybe not the right thing to do because suddenly something's changed.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a simple answer for that one. I think one thing though to take from it is that I had a tendency to want to sit back and then wait for the next follow-up to come to me. And I realized that I might needed to be really driving that process and pushing to book the next meeting for a particular role, push to understand what the next stage was, when that would happen, and really sort of try and be active in navigating that process rather than just sitting back and waiting for a recruiting quarter to reach out with a follow-up.
Yeah, that's a really good point, isn't it? Because I guess that's not necessarily what we'd expect. A lot of people, I'm sure, do shy away from pushing in those situations. So I think that it's good to know that, and I think particularly if you're hiring someone who's particularly senior or definitely in a sales role, you do want to see their ability to follow up. And that in itself can be criteria sometimes, can't it?
Yeah, and on the flip side of things, as a candidate, like you don't want to be too aggressive because then you're worried about, well, am I going to now seem almost desperate in looking for this opportunity and please hire me because I need to get a job. And that's the last thing I think you want to communicate. So you've got to find that balance in the middle there.
Yeah, and I guess that must be a different type of balance to find when you're actually not in a role at the moment as well. I guess you're more likely to be feeling a bit of a rush to secure something and more likely for them to pick up on that as well. How did you balance that? Did you, deliberately try and have multiple things on the go at once to create that urgency, or was that something that you didn't have to worry about?
So I I did try and create some urgency by having certainly several roles that I was pursuing at the same time. I also was quite clear on understanding what my limits were in terms of sort of how long I would allow this process to go on for. Frankly, like it's emotionally, this was something that really blindsided me during the process, is that it can be some really big up and downs. And it actually, in retrospect, is giving me, I think, a huge amount of appreciation for people who have to navigate this kind of thing all day, every day, particularly in sales or in business development, where I would have a week where I would send out a bunch of messages on LinkedIn, people would reply, I'd book meetings, I'd have good interviews, and I would finish that week on top of the world and feel like I was one step away from having a fantastic opportunity locked in. And then suddenly the next week, that opportunity would evaporate and all my emails would be sort of sitting there unread, and I'd be sort of refreshing Gmail and checking read receipts and pulling my hair out. It's like, well, why isn't anyone getting back to me? And I would be really struggling with that. And that was something that took, I suppose, a number of cycles for me to actually realize was happening, and then be able to get some perspective on and sort of manage that over the sort of the long haul.
Yeah, definitely. And as you say, that is reminiscent of sales and the ups and downs over that. And I think the other thing is it's about quantity sometimes, isn't it? You know, you need to keep up that activity to drive activity as well. So I guess there's a lot of crossover when you're considering this process to what someone might go through in a sales role as well. When you talked about the application process, you mentioned that some of them had lots of different rounds of interviews, some homework tasks, a variety of different elements that you had to do. How much of that was face-to-face immediately? Were companies starting off the process with a phone call or a video interview, or were they jumping straight into a face-to-face? Can you enlighten me on that process a little bit?
I don't think I started with a face-to-face in any circumstance unless I had sort of a warm introduction into the business through either someone that I'd reached out to and we were sort of doing a more informal coffee chat first and then talking about roles. I think where I was responding to an opportunity that I was aware of, the first couple of interactions were on the phone, no video cameras, and sort of going through sort of some pretty, I suppose, typical screening questions of really lasting like no more than about 20, 30 minutes max.
Yeah, which makes sense, doesn't it? Because you've got to start somewhere with those conversations. Okay, so as we go through this, I know you've got some key learnings that you have summarized from your experiences. Can you take us through what they are?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think there's a few things that like I would probably do differently if I was doing this all over again. I think for me that the really structured approach worked well, and I think having that criteria in my mind early of, well, these are the kind of roles, these are the kind of companies, this is the stage of company that I want to be working at. That was sort of a really good filter. It was a challenging filter at times, definitely, because I wasn't necessarily getting lots and lots of opportunities that aligned up against that. But in terms of, I suppose, if I had to break it down into a few things, I would really be investing more actively over the previous years in building my contacts here in the Bay Area. I think one of the things that I found challenging was that sort of being so heads down in my role and focused on App Annie, having not gone to school in the US, my network here is not as deep as sort of many others. And I really should have been building that very proactively sort of before I needed it. And then when I was sort of reaching for introductions, that was something that I was finding like, oh, I don't have a lot of mutual connections to these organizations that I'm trying to get into. And I realized I was keeping on coming back to the same few friends and few contacts who seem to be well connected. But that was something I feel like I could have very much been doing differently over the last few years. I think also I would have probably in the early stages sort of gone for volume and sort of kept my target role in industry and location in mind. But by going for volume, it would have sharpened my storytelling more quickly. It would have given me context for what the sort of recruiting structure is going to look like, what kind of conversation I'm going to have at what stage of the interview process. It's going to give me more confidence for when to bring up sort of more sensitive topics like compensation and how to frame those conversations. But I think also sort of one thing that's perhaps challenging in that is that if you're going for volume, you're going to walk away from a few things intentionally. And if you've been referred into that opportunity by a high quality referral, like a VC contact, you need to be careful about not creating a bad impression if you then turn around and walk away from something that you said was the right thing, but actually was you just testing the waters a little bit.
Yeah, it's a fine line there, isn't it?
It really is, I think, and definitely the contacts and the rapport that you have is definitely a very valuable asset, I've come to realize.
Definitely. And I want to just flip back to the storytelling component again, because I think this is super valuable, and I think it's something that people maybe don't think of in advance and don't have that pre-thinking or organization for. So can you tell us, what did you figure out were some of the key points that you could use in your story when you were talking to potential, hirers, I suppose?
Sure. I think some of the things that I found resonated really well, particularly for a product management conversation, were examples of taking things from 0 to 1, where you have a loose concept of an opportunity and you navigate that process and lead that process, ideally, of how you take that through to a product that is now in market with customers, generating an outcome for the business. I think that's a really compelling story to be able to tell.
Yeah, it's that growth, isn't it, that you're able to demonstrate then?
Yeah, exactly. Another couple would be around creating alignment and being able to get things done within teams and cross-functionally, and how you sort of resolve competing priorities. I think things like hard decisions that you had to make are always really compelling, when it wasn't clear necessarily what you had to do and there's a lot riding on it and you chose a path, how you navigated that. And certainly the other one that came up a lot was around how do you do customer research, and how do you do customer development, and how do you do user research, and how do you make sure that the thing you're proposing to build is actually going to hit with the market, and that you're not just going to build it and have no one use it.
Yeah, pretty important in product development, I'm sure.
I mean, I think it's the lifeblood of product development, but as we all know, there's hundreds, dozens, thousands of products that companies build and release every year that don't find a spot with their customers, that then die on the vine.
Yeah. So what you're saying here is that when you're meeting with prospective employers, that you want to be able to demonstrate what you've done in the past, how you've grown, how you've contributed to the organization, and how you've made sure that what you're working on is going to be successful. And I think that's stuff that we can apply to any role, really, isn't it?
I think it's not only stuff you can apply to any role. I think it's marketing at its sort of most fundamental piece, where you're being evaluated as the ability to solve a problem for someone, and whether or not they're going to spend money on you as a candidate to hire you, or they're going to spend money on some SaaS tool, or whether or not they're going to go after a particular sort of market segment. It's all about storytelling and getting clear on what is the value that you're going to bring to that organization, marrying that with their need, and creating that excitement that it's going to be a good deal and it's going to bring success for them and for you. And it's funny, I don't think at the time I realized how much of it was me going back to some of my marketing roots. But in retrospect now, it's just like, oh yeah, that was actually just sort of some fundamental marketing where I was the product.
Yes, definitely. And tell us, how did you end up getting your current role? What was the format that ended up, hitting home for you?
So it's funny. The role that I'm in today, I actually found on LinkedIn Jobs, which was probably out of all the various channels where I spent the least amount of time. And I had actually reached out to the hiring manager a few months previously on LinkedIn, because I had identified the company and I'd sort of done some research and thought, hey, this looks cool. I want to learn more. And I sent out a bunch of LinkedIn messages to their leadership team, and no one replied.
Right.
And
Okay.
they just went into my list of failed contacts and failed outreach. And it's like, all right, well, I guess I'll circle around for another try in a few months' time. Maybe they're all busy that week with a board meeting. I don't know.
Yep.
But then this role appeared on LinkedIn Jobs. And very quickly, we identified that, okay, there seems to be a good overlap here with some of the things that I've done in the past. We did sort of the usual kind of structured interviews where it's a couple of phone calls, it's meet a couple of team, come in and do some whiteboarding sessions. We did work through a bit of a case study where the hiring manager posed me some questions and I put together sort of a deck of some slides for him and we sort of discussed that. And then really sort of capped it off with a round of discussions with the rest of the executive leadership team there, and really quite quickly moved towards an offer.
Do you think they realized at any point that you had reached out previously? Or did you bring that up?
I joked about it, actually. I joked about it with the hiring manager, like on the first conversation I had with him. I reached out to you on LinkedIn a few months ago, and we weren't able to connect.
Yeah.
It was just that classic case of, I'm sorry, I was busy. I get dozens of LinkedIn messages, and your timing was not great.
Yeah.
It wasn't anything more than that.
Yeah. At the same time, I think that still shows that you were proactively making an effort and that they were of interest to you from the start. So, who knows whether that resonated in some way that might have underlined that as well.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of those tidbits and knowledge there. I think that's really fascinating and love that you're able to share that level of detail with us. And for those people who might be thinking about what their next role is ahead and now have a really structured process that they can follow and some great ideas on what they need to be thinking about well in advance as well. So thank you so much. Now, before we do wrap up today, I always ask the question, I'm always keen to understand how the people I interview organize their time, and a lot of that is around our calendars these days, our inboxes and our email. Do you have any processes or systems that you use to stay on top of those elements of your day?
Sure. I'm pretty bad with time management. I find that I am the kind of person that gets pretty easily distracted. My inbox is my enemy. If it's open, I just sort of sit there and let that drive my day. So I, over the last few years, have gotten sort of a system in place where I try and get really clear on what are the long-term outcomes that I'm looking for in my job, in my life. Sort of this navigating this search is probably a good example where I went in with, here's what I want. And I try and do that on a sort of 3 to 5 year horizon, which is probably going to sound a bit crazy. But I sort of try and think, okay, well, these are the outcomes that I'm looking for over that longer horizon, and then break it down and work backwards from there. Into here's what I want to get done in the next quarter. And then from there, it's like, here's what I want to get done in the next week. And try and keep that pretty simple. So there might only be 2 or 3 things on that list of here's what I want to get done for the next week. Even that, I'll probably very often only get 1 or 2 of those things done. But over time, sort of having that consistent focus, I've found really adds up. And I'll just sort of and I have gotten the habit of once a week, usually on a Sunday for 20 minutes, just sitting down and going, all right, well, did I get done this week what I'd hoped to get done? And if I have, fantastic, I'll put a check mark against it. And then what do I want to get done next week? And sort of, is that bringing me along to the outcomes that I want for this quarter? And just trusting then that that's going to sort of push me in the direction of hitting some of those longer term goals.
Do you use any systems or tools when you're tracking those goals and tasks?
I have got a really big just Google Doc where I write this stuff down. Cool. For me, I find that if it's not written down, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, definitely. Well, excellent. Thank you for sharing. It's always fascinating to hear the different approaches, and I think no one has the same approach as anyone else. Everyone does it their own unique way, but we might be able to learn from each other. So it's always something I throw in there.
Yeah, no, it's definitely like a challenging piece and it's something that's like I can find that I can drift for a long time. So it's still good to then have that calendar to fall back on when there is something that does need to get done. It's like, right, that's got to go in the calendar, and I'm going to need 2 hours to get that done. So let's get it done.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that calendarizing tasks is really important as well for those big things. Well, thank you so much, Nick, for being on the podcast today. It's been so good to catch up and to hear what you've been up to. And I love the structured approach that you've taken. So definitely speaks to me and how I work. And I'm sure it'll talk to many others as well. So thanks again for sharing. We really loved having you on the podcast.
No, thank you for having me. It's been great to chat.
Thanks for listening to this interview with Nick. If you want to connect with Nick, look him up on LinkedIn. In fact, Nick has agreed to share his detailed process and learnings around his job search on LinkedIn. So my suggested action from today's show is to look him up. It's Nick, N-I-C-K, McIntosh, M-C-I-N-T-O-S-H, and review his learnings. Please join me in the Interactive Minds Facebook group, where hundreds of marketers come together to answer questions, have discussions, and I share the latest news I'm seeing in the industry. You can access today's show notes at interactiveminds.com/podcast. See you next week.